The evening was filled with excitement and anticipation. The university's grand hall had never looked so beautiful. Strings of golden lights hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over the crowd. Elegant tables were arranged neatly, covered with white cloth and decorated with small flower vases. The smell of delicious food filled the air, and the gentle sound of live music added a touch of magic to the atmosphere. Everyone knew this wasn't just any ordinary gathering, it was a charity event, a celebration of hard work, generosity, and community. Among the crowd were professors, students, local leaders, and special guests. But the highlight of the evening was the arrival of a billionaire who had made his fortune. Through years of determination and vision, people whispered about him with admiration. He was well known for his sharp business skills and his massive donations to schools and hospitals. His presence at the event made everyone feel that this was a night to remember. Students looked at him with a mix of awe and curiosity, hoping to catch even a glimpse or maybe a word of encouragement from him. Standing quietly at one corner of the hall was Marcus, a young black student. He wasn't dressed in fancy clothes. Like many others, just a simple shirt and neat trousers, but his calm nature and observant eyes made him stand out in a different way. Marcus was not the type to seek attention. He was hardworking, intelligent, and carried a sense of responsibility, far beyond his years. While others were busy chatting and laughing, Marcus watched everything carefully, taking in details others might ignore. The food tables were placed at the center of the hall, beautifully arranged with dishes from different cultures. There were steaming bowls of pasta, trays of roasted meat, fresh salads, and desserts that looked like pieces of art. Guests moved from table to table, picking their favorite foods, praising the variety, and enjoying every bite. For many students, it was a rare treat to eat such luxurious meals, and they happily filled their plates. The billionaire walked into the hall with a confident but friendly smile. Immediately, people surrounded him, eager to shake his hand or take a photo. He greeted them warmly, showing a surprising humility despite his wealth. Cameras flashed, and the crowd buzzed with excitement. For Marcus, it was the first time he had seen such a powerful man up close. But instead of joining the rush, Marcus stayed back, quietly observing. He noticed how the billionaire's eyes scanned the hall, how he greeted the professors with respect, and how he took his time to listen to the students who nervously introduced themselves. Marcus admired him not for his money, but for his willingness to be among ordinary people without arrogance. Still, Marcus also believed that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was beyond making mistakes. As the evening went on, laughter echoed, and clinking glasses filled the room with cheer. The billionaire finally made his way toward the food table. He seemed genuinely impressed by the variety, complimenting the chefs and encouraging students to eat well. Marcus's eyes followed him carefully, almost unconsciously. Something deep inside told him to keep watching. The billionaire's hand reached toward a particular dish. It was a beautiful platter, decorated with herbs and colorful garnishes, making it look almost too perfect. People around him didn't notice anything unusual. They were too busy chatting and enjoying themselves. But Marcus had already been paying attention to that same dish earlier. Something about its smell had caught his attention, something that didn't seem right. While everyone else ignored it, Marcus had quietly kept it in mind. And now, as the billionaire leaned closer to the table, ready to pick up a serving spoon, Marcus felt his heart beat faster. The atmosphere of celebration suddenly felt heavy to him. He didn't want to embarrass himself in front of everyone. But he also couldn't ignore what he had sensed. At that moment, the hall looked perfect from the outside glittering lights. Joyful conversations, the presence of a respected billionaire, and the pride of the university shining brightly. Yet, hidden within that perfect setting was the beginning of a moment that would soon turn the entire night into a story no one would ever forget. Marcus, The quiet student standing in the corner was about to change the course of the evening, with just one loud warning. A warning that would freeze the billionaire in his tracks and leave the entire crowd stunned. The chatter of the crowd grew louder as the billionaire stood in front of the buffet table, holding a shiny silver plate in his hand. Everyone nearby watched him with curiosity. What would a man of his wealth and influence choose to eat? People laughed and joked, whispering about his choices as if even his taste in food might reveal some secret about success. The cameras of a few eager students clicked quietly, capturing every move he made. The billionaire leaned forward slightly, scanning the colorful dishes that stretched across the long table. His hand hovered above a particular platter. It looked especially inviting, golden in color, decorated with slices of lemon and fresh herbs. The smell was strong, almost too strong, but no one else seemed to notice. In fact, a group of students near the table nodded approvingly, whispering about how delicious it looked. The billionaire smiled and prepared to serve himself a portion, and then it happened. A loud, sharp voice cut through the laughter and music like a knife. "Don't eat that." The hall went silent in an instant. Forks and spoons paused mid-air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and every pair of eyes turned toward the voice. It was Marcus. The quiet student who usually blended into the background now stood tall. His hands slightly raised, his eyes fixed on the billionaire. His voice wasn't shaky or uncertain, it was strong, urgent, and impossible to ignore. The billionaire froze, his hand still hovering above the platter. His eyes narrowed in surprise, and for a moment he didn't move at all. The silence in the room felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. People turned to Marcus in shock. How could a student dare to shout at one of the most powerful men in the world? Some students gasped, others whispered nervously, and a few even chuckled, thinking it might be a prank. Professors frowned, uncomfortable with the sudden outburst. The billionaire, however, did not laugh. He lowered his hands slowly and turned his gaze fully toward Marcus. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of curiosity and irritation. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't look away. He knew he had risked everything by speaking up so boldly. He could be asked to leave the hall, humiliated in front of everyone, or even face consequences from the university. But deep inside, he also knew he could not stay silent. "Don't eat that," Marcus repeated, this time softer but still firm, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the hall. The billionaire set down his plate on the table and straightened his posture. "And why not?" he asked in a calm but serious tone that carried across the room. His voice was not angry, but there was a weight to it, as though he expected a very good reason for such a dramatic interruption. The crowd leaned forward, waiting to see what Marcus would say. Students whispered behind their hands, and some, even, pulled out their phones to record the unusual moment. Professors exchanged worried glances, unsure whether they should intervene or let the situation play out. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing, but his eyes steady. "Sir," he said carefully, "there's something wrong with that dish. I noticed it earlier. The smell, the color, it isn't fresh. Please, don't eat it." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some shook their heads, dismissing his claim as nonsense. Others leaned closer to the table, sniffing discreetly, trying to decide if Marcus was right. The billionaire, however, didn't immediately respond. Instead, he studied Marcus as if weighing the truth of his words, not just by their logic, but by the courage it took to say them. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The tension in the hall was so thick that even the music from the live band faltered and stopped. Everyone waited for the billionaire's reaction. Finally, he gave a short nod to one of the event organizers. "Check it," he said firmly. The organizers hurried to the table, their faces pale with nervousness. They removed the platter and carried it toward the kitchen staff. The silence in the hall continued, broken only by hushed whispers. All eyes remained on Marcus and the billionaire. Marcus stood still, his palms sweating, but he refused to back down. The billionaire remained motionless, his face calm but unreadable. A T had been stopped in his tracks by a student, something that had probably never happened to him before. Minutes later, a staff member returned with a shocked expression. Whispering something urgently into the organizer's ear, they both turned toward the billionaire. The organizer's face had gone pale. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking loud enough for the room to hear. "Sir." The student was right. The dish had gone bad. If you had eaten it, it could have made you very sick. Gasps filled the hall. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, some students covering their mouths in disbelief. Professors looked at Marcus with a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. And the billionaire, he simply stood there, frozen, absorbing what he had just heard. He slowly turned back toward Marcus. For a man who had faced boardrooms, negotiations, and challenges worth billions of dollars, it was rare for him to be caught completely off guard. Yet here he was, frozen not by fear of a financial loss, but by the realization that his health and, perhaps, even his life had just been protected by the courage of a student who dared to speak. When no one else did, the hall remained silent once more. The billionaire opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, still trying to process the moment. Marcus had not just interrupted an ordinary dinner. He had changed the course of the evening, and perhaps something much greater. The room seemed to stop breathing. Time itself felt frozen as the billionaire stood still, his hand resting on the edge of the buffet table, his face unreadable. The echo of Marcus's warning still hung in the air, bouncing off the walls of the grand hall. Moments earlier, the evening had been filled with laughter and music. Now, the silence was so heavy that even the clinking of glasses had stopped. People shifted nervously in their seats, whispering under their breath, but no one dared to speak. Too loudly, the billionaire had built his reputation on control. He was known for staying calm in the face of chaos, for never letting emotions dictate his decisions. In boardrooms, during crises, and even in the toughest negotiations, he was the man who always knew what to say and what to do. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt something unusual. He felt uncertain. His sharp eyes were locked on Marcus, the student who had just shouted across the hall. In that moment, the billionaire's mind raced with questions. Who is this young man? Why would he speak up in front of everyone? Could he really know something the rest of us missed? Or was this all some kind of foolish mistake? The billionaire's hand slowly pulled back from the dish. He didn't touch his plate, didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply froze, caught. In the strange tension of the moment, his usually confident posture looked different now, more cautious, more guarded. People around him exchanged glances, unsure whether he would explode in anger or laugh the situation off. Across the hall, Marcus stood tall, though his legs trembled slightly beneath him. His heart was pounding so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. Yet, he kept his eyes on the billionaire, refusing to back down. He had no idea what the consequences of his outburst might be. Would the billionaire dismiss him? Would the professors scold him for embarrassing their guest? Would the other students laugh at him for overreacting? Still, he knew he had done the right thing, and that gave him strength. The billionaire finally moved. He turned slightly, looking around the hall. He noticed how every single face was focused on him. Students, professors, staff members, everyone was waiting for his reaction. For a man used to being the center of attention, this felt different. This wasn't admiration or curiosity. This was suspense. The entire hall was balanced on the edge of his response. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, as if steadying himself. His eyes returned to Marcus, studying him carefully. The young man's posture, his tone, his unwavering gaze, none of it suggested a prank or disrespect. Instead, it spoke of urgency, of genuine concern. The billionaire felt a small, chill run down his spine. Something about Marcus reminded him of his younger self, the part of him that once dared to speak truth, even when it was uncomfortable. But he couldn't allow himself to show that just yet. He stood silently, frozen in thought. Around him, whispers grew louder. Why did he yell like that? Was the food really bad? He's in trouble now, for sure. The professors whispered among themselves too. Some frowned, embarrassed by the disruption. Others glanced at Marcus with cautious respect, wondering what would drive a student to speak so boldly. A few even silently hoped the young man was wrong, for the sake of keeping peace. The billionaire raised his hand slightly, and the room immediately quieted again. His voice was calm but firm. "Bring the dish to the kitchen," instructed one of the staff members. The staff hurried away, carrying the platter carefully, as though it now held some dangerous secret. The billionaire remained perfectly still, watching the door through, which the staff had exited. His mind was frozen between doubt and curiosity. If Marcus was wrong, it would be an embarrassing moment for him. If Marcus was right, then the billionaire had just escaped something far worse than embarrassment. The tension grew unbearable. Every second stretched longer than the last. Marcus shifted slightly on his feet, but kept his head high. The billionaire noticed the determination in his eyes. There was no arrogance there, no desire to humiliate. Only truth. Minutes later, the staff returned, their faces pale. They whispered something to the event organizer, who swallowed hard before speaking aloud. His voice cracked slightly as he announced, "The dish. It was spoiled. It wasn't safe to eat." The words struck the room like thunder. Gasps filled the air, and conversations exploded in shocked voices. Some students covered their mouths. Others looked at Marcus in awe. Professors exchanged stunned looks, realizing the young man had been right all along. But the billionaire, he didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes still locked on Marcus. For a man who had faced million-dollar risks, hostile takeovers, and political storms, it was rare to feel powerless. Yet at this moment, he felt it. His life, his health, his very existence had been unknowingly balanced on the edge of disaster. And the only thing that saved him was the courage of a student who refused to stay silent. For the first time in many years, the billionaire felt vulnerable. It was an unfamiliar, uncomfortable feeling. He realized how fragile even the strongest person could be, and how easily fate could shift in a single second. He froze not because of fear alone, but because of the overwhelming truth. His life had been protected not by wealth, not by power, not by security, but by the voice of someone society often overlooked. The crowd kept buzzing, but the billionaire remained still, frozen in thought. His silence spoke louder than words. And though he hadn't said it yet, deep inside he knew. He owed Marcus more than just gratitude. He owed him respect. The billionaire's silence was heavier than any words. His eyes, sharp and calculating, remained fixed on Marcus. Around them, the room hummed with shock. Students whispered, professors exchanged anxious glances, and staff members shifted nervously, unsure of what might happen next. Yet Marcus did not waver. He stood tall, his hands clenched at his sides, his breath steady, despite the weight of 100 eyes staring at him. Finally, the billionaire broke the silence. His voice was low, but carried across the hall. "You," he said, pointing slightly toward Marcus. "Come here." The crowd parted like water. all eyes widening as Marcus took a slow step forward. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face showed no fear. Step by step, he walked across the shining marble floor until he stood only a few feet from the billionaire. The difference between them was striking, one dressed in a fine tailored suit worth thousands, the other in a simple shirt and trousers. Yet at that moment, they stood as equals, their connection forged by a truth that could not be denied. The billionaire tilted his head, studying Marcus. "You shouted, in front of everyone. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, sir." Marcus replied, his voice steady. "But I also understood what it would mean if I stayed silent." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The billionaire's brows furrowed slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity. He folded his arms, inviting Marcus to explain. Marcus took a breath, his eyes flicking briefly toward the table where the spoiled dish had been. "When I arrived earlier, I noticed something. That platter didn't smell right. It was strong, sharper than the others. Most people didn't notice because of the decorations, the garnishes, and the mix of smells from all the other dishes. But I've worked in kitchens before, part-time jobs to support myself. I know what food is supposed to smell like, and I know what it smells like when it's gone bad." The billionaire raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You were sure of this?" Marcus nodded firmly. "I wasn't 100% certain, sir, but I was sure enough that I couldn't let you take the risk. Not you, not anyone. I couldn't just stand there and say nothing." The hall was so quiet that even the faint hum of the lights above could be heard. Students leaned in closer, drawn into Marcus's words. Professors who had dismissed him moments earlier now looked thoughtful. And the billionaire. He remained perfectly still, his piercing gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "Do you realize," the billionaire said slowly, "that if you had been wrong, you would have embarrassed yourself. You would have embarrassed this entire university." Marcus swallowed but didn't look away. "Yes, sir, I knew that. But I also knew what could happen if I was right. Sometimes the risk of speaking up is smaller than the cost of staying silent." The billionaire's lips twitched, almost as if fighting back a smile. For the first time that evening, the mask of control on his face began to crack. There was something in Marcus's words, something honest, something bold that touched him in a way few people ever managed. The organizer of the event cleared his throat nervously, stepping forward. "Sir, we deeply apologize for the oversight. The catering service will." The billionaire raised his hand to silence him without even looking his way. His attention remained fully on Marcus. "So, you noticed what no one else did. When no one else would. And you risked your reputation for the sake of others." Marcus hesitated only for a moment before answering. "I didn't think about reputation, sir. I only thought about what was right." A hush fell over the hall. The billionaire stared at Marcus, and for the first time, he felt something stir inside him, something he had buried long ago. Memories of his own youth when he too had been a boy with nothing but courage and determination, fighting for every chance, every opportunity. He remembered what it felt like to speak the truth and be doubted, to stand alone yet refuse to give in. And now, standing before him, Marcus was a reflection of that same fire. The billionaire uncrossed his arms and stepped closer, closing the space between them. The difference in their heights was noticeable, but in spirit, Marcus stood just as tall. "What's your name?" the billionaire asked quietly. "Marcus, sir." "Marcus Reed." "Marcus," the billionaire repeated, almost as if testing the weight of the name on his tongue. "You may have just saved me from something far worse than embarrassment tonight. Do you realize that?" Marcus nodded, but this time he said nothing. His silence carried the weight of truth. It wasn't about recognition or praise. He had done what he believed was right. Nothing more, nothing less. The billionaire took a step back, his gaze softening. He was no longer frozen in disbelief, but he was still processing the gravity of what had happened. He turned slowly, looking at the crowd. "This young man," he said, loudly enough for all to hear, "saw what no one else did. He spoke when no one else dared. That deserves more than just acknowledgement." The crowd erupted in applause, hesitant at first, then stronger, echoing through the hall. Marcus shifted awkwardly under the sudden wave of attention, but the billionaire lifted a hand to steady the room. The explanation had begun not just about the spoiled food, but about something greater. It was an explanation of courage, of responsibility, of how one voice could change the outcome of an entire night. And though Marcus's words had been simple, their meaning cut deep into everyone present. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it is always necessary. The billionaire, for the first time in years, felt humbled. And Marcus, for the first time in his life, realized that even a student's voice could carry enough weight to stop a giant in his tracks. Asterisk. The hall had not yet recovered from the billionaire's words when the tension shifted again. The applause faded into murmurs, and the organizers huddled nervously near the kitchen doors. Though Marcus's explanation had made sense, the final confirmation of the spoiled dish was not enough for everyone. Doubt still hung in the air. The billionaire knew it too. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Marcus again. "You spoke with courage," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "But courage is not the same as truth. Truth must stand the test of proof." Chill ran through the audience. Was he doubting Marcus now? Was this his way of turning the situation around? Marcus stood, motionless, his jaw tight, but his eyes steady. The billionaire signaled to one of his assistants. "Bring in the head chef." Moments later, a tall man in a white coat and chef's hat entered, his face pale and nervous. He bowed slightly to the billionaire, then glanced uneasily at Marcus, who remained standing near the buffet. "This young man claims the dish was unsafe," the billionaire said firmly. "I want you to test it properly, in front of everyone, so there is no doubt." The chef hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of being tested in front of hundreds of people. His reputation was on the line. The billionaire's sharp eyes gave him no choice. He nodded quickly and motioned for the kitchen staff to bring the discarded platter back into the hall. When the dish reappeared, all eyes locked onto it as if it were an object of mystery and danger. The golden meat that had looked so tempting earlier now seemed sinister, its garnishes failing to mask the truth beneath. The chef carefully uncovered it, and a faint, sour odor rose into the air. A few students wrinkled their noses, whispering to each other. The billionaire crossed his arms, waiting. Well, the chef cleared his throat. "Sir, the student is correct. The meat was spoiled. The refrigeration must have failed during transport. If consumed, it could have caused food poisoning, severe food poisoning." Gasps spread across the hall. Some students instinctively pushed their plates away, suddenly suspicious of everything they had eaten. Professors looked pale. The staff exchanged panicked glances, realizing the disaster they had narrowly avoided. But the billionaire's expression remained calm. His eyes returned to Marcus. "You see," he said, his tone softer now, almost reflective. "The truth can be tested." And it stood the test. The crowd erupted again, this time with stronger applause and nods of admiration toward Marcus. But the billionaire wasn't finished. He held up a hand, silencing the hall once more. "Marcus," he said, using his name for the first time in front of everyone. "Tell me this. Why did you speak when no one else did? Many must have walked past this dish. Many must have sensed something was wrong, yet none of them said a word." Marcus hesitated for a moment. His eyes scanned the faces in the crowd faces. that had once looked at him with suspicion, but now carried a strange mix of respect and guilt. Then he spoke, his voice clear. "Because I know what it feels like to stay silent and regret it later. I've seen people suffer because no one wanted to take responsibility. I couldn't let that happen again, not if I could prevent it." The hall grew so quiet that every word rang out like a bell. The billionaire studied him carefully. His face, usually cold and unreadable, showed something new, something human. He turned to the audience, raising his voice. "What this young man has shown us tonight is more valuable than money, more valuable than reputation. He has shown us the courage to act, the courage to risk being wrong for the sake of doing what is right. And that," he said, pausing for effect, "is the kind of courage that changes lives." The applause that followed shook the hall. Students stood, clapping loudly, some even cheering Marcus's name. Professors who had once frowned at him now smiled with pride. Even the staff members, usually invisible in such events, joined in, their relief pouring out in their applause. Marcus shifted uneasily, not used to such attention. He hadn't spoken to be praised. He'd spoken because it was necessary. Yet now, standing before the billionaire and hundreds of people, he realized his actions had become something bigger than himself. The billionaire's assistant whispered something in his ear, but he waved him off. His eyes remained fixed on Marcus. Slowly, he stepped forward, closing the distance until he stood face to face with the student. The height difference was still there, but it no longer mattered. The billionaire's voice dropped low, meant only for Marcus to hear. "You passed the test tonight, not just of food, but of character. Do you understand what that means?" Marcus swallowed, unsure how to respond. But the billionaire didn't wait for an answer. He straightened, his voice booming once more for the entire hall. "This is not the end of the test. This is only the beginning." The words hung in the air like a promise, or perhaps a challenge. The crowd cheered again, but Marcus felt a strange weight settle on his shoulders. The spoiled dish had been tested. Yes, its instincts had been proven. Right. But now, it was clear the billionaire had something bigger in mind. Something that would test Marcus not just as a student, but as a person. And Marcus, though he didn't know what was coming, felt ready. The applause still echoed faintly in the grand hall, but the energy had shifted. It was no longer the noisy excitement of a party, it was something deeper, heavier, almost sacred. People had stopped seeing Marcus as just another student. He had become the center of the night, the name whispered at every table, the face that drew more attention than even the billionaire himself. And yet, Marcus didn't bask in it. He stood quietly, his eyes lowered for a moment as though the weight of all that attention was too much. He hadn't shouted because he wanted praise. He hadn't spoken up to be remembered. He had done it simply because his conscience left him. No choice. Still, here he was, being treated like a hero in a hall that had moments ago barely noticed his presence. The billionaire, however, stood motionless, his gaze locked on Marcus. He wasn't looking at him as a student anymore. He wasn't even looking at him as someone who had prevented a disaster. No, he was looking at him as if he were a mirror. A mirror that reflected back something he had almost forgotten: humility, honesty, and the raw courage to act when no one else dared. For the billionaire, realization came like a sudden storm. All his wealth, all his power, all the empires he had built, none of it had protected him tonight. Not his private security team, not the finest chefs, not the carefully planned event. He had been seconds away from eating spoiled food that could have put him in the hospital or worse. And who saved him? Not another wealthy executive, not a politician, not one of the many people who constantly sought his favor. No, it was a student. A young man with nothing but courage in his voice and truth in his eyes. The thought shook him. For so long, he had believed his money could shield him from the dangers of the world. He had lived inside walls of privilege, surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear. But tonight, those walls had cracked. Tonight, he had been reminded of his own vulnerability, his own humanity. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then he spoke not to Marcus, not to the staff, but to the entire hall. His voice was firm, but softer than before, carrying a weight of sincerity that surprised everyone. "Do you know what I realized tonight?" he began, his eyes scanning the room. "That no matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you have, you are never beyond danger. And sometimes the greatest protection comes not from wealth, but from people who care enough to speak the truth." The hall grew silent once more. Students leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Professors exchanged thoughtful glances, as if realizing they, too, had something to learn from this moment. The billionaire continued. "I was seconds away from making a mistake that could have cost me dearly. And it wasn't my advisors, or my bodyguards, or even the organizers of this event who stopped me. It was a student. A young man who had no reason to protect me, no reward to expect, and every reason to stay quiet. Yet he chose to speak." His eyes returned to Marcus, and for a brief second, the billionaire's voice softened. "That kind of courage humbles me." A ripple of emotion swept through the crowd. Many of the students who had once looked at the billionaire as untouchable now saw him differently. He wasn't just a man of wealth anymore. He was human, capable of fear, of mistakes, of gratitude. And Marcus, the quiet student from the corner of the hall, had reminded him of that truth. Marcus felt the billionaire's words like a weight, pressing against his chest. He hadn't expected such honesty from a man so powerful. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with being praised so openly. But he couldn't deny the sincerity in the billionaire's tone. The billionaire stepped forward, closer to Marcus, and lowered his voice enough that only a few nearby could hear. "You know, Marcus, people like me, we forget. We forget what it feels like to be vulnerable. We surround ourselves with layers of safety, but it makes us blind. Tonight, you reminded me that sometimes the simplest truth can save a life." Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being addressed so personally, so respectfully. By someone of such status, the billionaire straightened again, turning back to the audience. "What happened here tonight is not just about spoiled food. It's about awareness. It's about responsibility. And it's about listening to voices we often overlook." The audience erupted in applause once more, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't the applause of admiration for wealth or power. It was the applause of agreement, of awakening as the sound filled the hall. The billionaire allowed himself a small smile, not of pride, but of gratitude. Gratitude for being reminded of something he had almost lost: perspective. And Marcus, in that moment, he realized something too. He realized that courage isn't just about saving someone from harm. Sometimes, courage is about holding up a mirror so others can see the truth they've forgotten. Tonight, he hadn't just saved the billionaire from a poisoned dish. He had reminded him and everyone else that even the strongest can fall. And even the smallest voice can lift them back up. The realization hung heavy in the air, touching everyone in the room in ways words could hardly capture. It was no longer just a charity event. It had become a lesson, a memory, a turning point, and deep inside, both Marcus and the billionaire knew the night was far from over. The billionaire stood tall at the front of the hall, his presence commanding as always. But something about him had changed. His tone was softer, his expression more human, his voice touched by humility that few had ever heard from him before. The realization of what Marcus had done weighed heavily on him, and gratitude swelled inside. Gratitude so deep it could not be hidden behind the polished armor of wealth and pride. The applause slowly died down, leaving only the sound of people's breaths and the faint hum of lights above. Then, in front of the entire crowd, the billionaire turned fully toward Marcus. His sharp eyes softened, and for the first time, his lips curved into something genuine, not the practiced smile of a public figure, but the warm, almost vulnerable smile of a man who had been saved. He lifted his voice, clear and firm. "Marcus Reed," he said the name like a declaration, making sure everyone in the hall heard it. "Tonight, you have done more than stop me from making a dangerous mistake. You have reminded me, and all of us, of the importance of courage and honesty. You have reminded me that no matter who we are, rich or poor, powerful or ordinary, we are all human. And sometimes, it takes one brave voice to protect us all." The audience erupted in applause again, louder and longer than before. This time, many stood to their feet, clapping until their palms stung. Some students even whistled and cheered Marcus's name, while professors nodded proudly. Realizing the lesson that had unfolded before their eyes, Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment. He wasn't used to such attention, and though the applause filled the hall like thunder, he felt small in the spotlight. He wanted to shrink back into the corner where he had started the evening, but there was no going back now. His act of courage had pulled him to the center of the stage, and he couldn't escape it. The billionaire raised a hand, quieting the crowd again. His eyes never left Marcus as he continued. "I owe you my gratitude, and not just words." He paused, his voice deepening. "Words are easy. Actions are what matter." A hush swept over the room. People leaned forward, sensing something extraordinary was about to happen. Marcus blinked, confused, his chest tightening with nervous anticipation. The billionaire stepped closer until he stood directly in front of Marcus. He extended his hand, strong and steady. The same hand that had signed billion-dollar contracts and shaken hands with world leaders. And yet, at this moment, it reached out not as a symbol of power, but of respect. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying both strength and sincerity. The hall seemed to exhale as Marcus hesitated, then slowly extended his hand. There. Palms met in a firm shake, and in that instant, the applause burst out once more, echoing louder than before. But Marcus hardly noticed it. For him, the moment wasn't about the sound of the crowd, it was about the weight of the billionaire's gratitude. Something real and undeniable pressed into his hand. The billionaire leaned closer, his voice low enough for Marcus alone. "You reminded me tonight that even with everything I own, I can still be vulnerable. And you taught me that sometimes the greatest wealth comes from the simplest act of courage. That is something I will not forget." Marcus's throat tightened, his voice catching as he whispered, "I didn't do it for recognition, sir. I just couldn't stay silent." The billionaire nodded slowly, his expression serious, "And that is exactly why you deserve recognition." He released Marcus's hand and turned back to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget this night. Let us not forget that one student, one voice, one act of bravery protected us all from what could have been disaster. Gratitude is not enough for what he has done, but it is the least we can give." The audience stood again, this time in a full standing ovation. Even professors who rarely showed emotion clapped with genuine admiration. The staff wiped nervous sweat from their brows, thankful for Marcus's sharp eye. Students shouted his name, their voices rising in unison. "Marcus! Marcus!" Marcus felt overwhelmed. He hadn't sought to be a hero. He had only wanted to prevent harm. But now, standing there, hearing his name echo through the grand hall, he realized that sometimes doing the right thing brings rewards you never expect. The billionaire lifted his hand once more, calming the crowd, and his tone shifted. It was no longer the polished voice of a businessman, it was the heartfelt tone of a man truly humbled. Gratitude, he said, is not just about saying thank you. It is about remembering, about honoring, and about giving back. Marcus Reed. You have given me something no amount of money could buy: safety, humility, and truth. And for that, you will have my gratitude, not just tonight, but always. Marcus swallowed hard, his chest heavy with emotion. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen, not for his background, not for his struggles, not for what he lacked, but for his courage, for his heart. And in that moment, under the golden lights of the hall, Marcus understood that gratitude wasn't just about words spoken in front of a crowd. Gratitude could change lives. And this gratitude, from the most powerful man he had ever met, was about to change his in ways he could not yet imagine.